In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where rows of houses stood neatly lined up and trees swayed gently in the breeze, life moved at a steady pace. Every morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, the streets came alive with familiar sounds. The chirping of birds, the distant hum of cars, and the rhythmic clatter of garbage bins being emptied. Among these everyday noises was Mrs. Elena Ruiz, a hard-working garbage collector who had been part of the community for years. Elena wasn't just any ordinary worker. She carried herself with grace and warmth despite her demanding job. Her bright smile could light up even the dullest mornings, but most people barely noticed her. To many, she was simply the garbage lady, someone whose presence blended into the background like wallpaper. But Elena didn't mind. She took pride in her work, knowing that without her efforts, the neighborhood wouldn't stay as clean and pleasant as it was. Still, there were days when she wished someone would stop to say hello or acknowledge her beyond a quick nod. Not far from where Elena worked lived Tommy Anderson, an 8-year-old boy with a mop of curly hair and eyes full of curiosity. Tommy was different from other kids his age. He noticed things others often missed. While most children hurried past the garbage truck on their way to school, Tommy always paused to wave at Elena. Sometimes, he'd shout a cheerful good morning, which made her laugh and wave back. It wasn't much, but those small moments meant the world to her. Tommy's house sat near the corner of the street, its front yard decorated with colorful flowers his mom lovingly tended to. On some afternoons, Tommy could be found outside, drawing pictures with chalk on the driveway or playing with his toy cars. He loved imagining adventures, turning ordinary objects into magical props for his games. One day, as Elena approached his house during her route, she spotted him crouched on the ground, scribbling furiously with a piece of blue chalk. Curious, she stopped her cart and leaned over the fence. "Hey there, champ," she called out with a grin. "What are you working on?" Tommy looked up, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Ruiz. I'm making invitations for my birthday party next week." "Wow, a birthday party. That sounds exciting," Elena said, genuinely interested. She stepped closer to get a better look. The chalk drawings were vibrant and creative, filled with balloons, cakes, and stick figures holding hands. Each one read, "You're invited to Tommy's birthday bash." As they chatted, Tommy asked Elena if she'd ever been to a birthday party. Her answer surprised him. "No, not really," she admitted with a soft chuckle. "I don't think anyone's ever invited me." Tommy tilted his head thoughtfully, his young mind processing this information. Then, without hesitation, he grabbed another piece of chalk and added a new name to the list of guests. "Well, you're coming to mine," he declared proudly. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected invitation. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. No one had ever included her in something so personal before. Finally, she managed a heartfelt thank you and promised to try her best to attend. Little did either of them know, this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events neither could have imagined. As Elena returned to her truck and continued her rounds, she couldn't help but smile, feeling the spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. And Tommy? He went back to his drawings, already dreaming of how fun his party would be, with Mrs. Ruiz there, of course. As Mrs. Ruiz stepped into the lively backyard, a mix of excitement and nervousness washed over her. The scene was vibrant. Children darted around, chasing each other with balloons, while parents chatted near the snack table laden with cupcakes, chips, and punch. Colorful streamers fluttered in the gentle breeze, and cheerful music played softly in the background. Despite the festive atmosphere, Mrs. Ruiz couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't quite belong. After all, this wasn't just any gathering. It was a child's birthday party, full of giggles, games, and innocence, a world she hadn't been part of in decades. Tommy, however, wasted no time putting her at ease. He grabbed her hand and tugged her gently toward the center of the yard. "Come on, Mrs. Ruiz. I want you to meet everyone," he said, his enthusiasm infectious. Before she could protest, he began introducing her to his friends. "This is Jake, and that's Mia, and over there is Lily. They're my best friends." Each child responded with wide-eyed curiosity, some shyly waving while others boldly asked questions about her job. "Do you really pick up trash every day?" one boy asked, his tone filled with awe rather than judgment. Mrs. Ruiz chuckled, kneeling down to his level. "Yes, I do. And guess what? Sometimes I find really cool things people throw away, like old toys or books." The kids erupted into chatter, fascinated by the idea of discovering treasures in garbage bins. Seeing their interest, Mrs. Ruiz launched into a story about finding a perfectly good soccer ball once, which she had cleaned up and donated to a local shelter. The children listened intently, hanging onto her every word. For the first time, she felt like more than just a garbage collector. She felt like a storyteller, someone whose experiences mattered. Meanwhile, Tommy's parents watched from a distance, quietly relieved to see how well Mrs. Ruiz was fitting in. Sarah walked over with a plate of snacks and handed it to her. "Here, take a break," she said kindly. "You deserve it after all your hard work." Mrs. Ruiz accepted the plate with gratitude, savoring not just the food, but also the warmth of being treated as an equal. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself laughing along with the group during silly party games and even helping tie ribbons onto prizes for the winners. She never imagined she'd end up playing musical chairs with a bunch of energetic 8-year-olds, but when Tommy insisted, she joined in and ended up winning a round, much to everyone's delight. By the time cake was served, Mrs. Ruiz had forgotten her initial discomfort. She sat next to Tommy at the picnic table, watching as he blew out the candles surrounded by cheering friends. When it came time to hand out slices of chocolate cake, Tommy made sure she got the biggest piece. "You're my favorite guest," he whispered with a grin. That simple comment touched her deeply. It wasn't just the cake or the stories. It was the realization that someone saw her, truly saw her, beyond her uniform and her job title. For years, she'd gone unnoticed, blending into the backdrop of daily life. But today, thanks to a little boy with a big heart, she felt visible again. When the party began winding down and guests started heading home, Mrs. Ruiz lingered for a moment, reluctant to leave. Tommy hugged her tightly before she went, promising to visit her on her route soon. As she walked back to her truck, clutching the small memento Tommy had pressed into her hands, a handmade thank you card decorated with glitter and stickers, she felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying had lifted. What she didn't know yet was that this day would be the beginning of something extraordinary, not just for her, but for the entire community. The days leading up to Tommy's birthday party buzzed with excitement. For Tommy, it wasn't just about the cake or the games. It was about making sure Mrs. Ruiz felt included and special. He couldn't stop thinking about her reaction when he'd invited her. Her smile had been so warm, so genuine, that it made him feel like he'd done something truly important. But as the big day approached, doubts began creeping into his young mind. What if she didn't come? What if she forgot? Or worse, what if she thought he was just being silly? Tommy shared his worries with his parents over dinner one evening. His mom, Sarah, wiped her hands on a dish towel and gave him a reassuring smile. "Mrs. Ruiz seemed really touched by your invitation, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm sure she'll do her best to be there." Still, Sarah exchanged a glance with her husband, Mark, who raised an eyebrow. They both knew inviting someone like Mrs. Ruiz, a woman they barely interacted with outside of polite hellos, was unusual. Would it make her uncomfortable? Would their neighbors think it was strange? Despite their concerns, they decided to support Tommy's decision. After all, his heart was in the right place. So the family worked together to prepare for the party, hanging colorful streamers across the living room and setting up tables in the backyard. Tommy insisted on making a separate sign that read, "Welcome, Mrs. Ruiz," in bold letters. He taped it to the front door himself, standing back to admire his handiwork with a satisfied grin. Finally, The morning of the party arrived. The sun shone brightly, casting golden light over the neighborhood. Tommy woke up early, too excited to sleep any longer. He ran around the house, double-checking everything. The balloons were tied securely, the snacks were arranged neatly, and the playlist of cheerful songs was ready to go. As guests started arriving, friends from school, neighbors, and even a few cousins, Tommy kept glancing toward the driveway, hoping to see Mrs. Roos's familiar face. His mom noticed his fidgeting and knelt beside him. "She might still be working, honey," she said softly. "You know how busy her job is." Tommy nodded but didn't say anything. He wanted to believe she'd show up, even though part of him feared she wouldn't. Just as Sarah was about to suggest starting without her, there was a soft knock at the door. Tommy sprinted to answer it, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. When he opened the door, there she was, Mrs. Roos, wearing her usual work uniform but looking extra neat, as though she'd taken extra care getting ready. In her hands, she held a small, carefully wrapped gift wrapped in shiny blue paper. "Hi, Tommy," she said, her voice warm and a little shy. "I hope I'm not late." Tommy's face lit up like a firework. "You came," he exclaimed, throwing his arms around her in a tight hug. For a moment, Mrs. Roos looked surprised, then deeply moved. She hugged him back, blinking away tears she hadn't expected to shed. Sarah appeared behind Tommy, smiling warmly. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Roos. We're so glad you're here." "It means a lot to me," Mrs. Roos replied, her voice trembling slightly. "No one's ever invited me to a party before." As Tommy led her inside, introducing her to everyone and showing her the sign he'd made just for her, Mrs. Roos felt a wave of emotions she hadn't experienced in years. She'd always known Tommy was a kind boy, but this act of inclusion went beyond kindness. It was a reminder that she mattered, that her hard work was seen and appreciated. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Roos felt like she belonged somewhere. And as the party unfolded around them, laughter filling the air and children running through the yard, she realized this simple invitation might change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, as the sun peeked over the rooftops and painted the streets with golden light, Mrs. Roos began her usual routine. She climbed into her garbage truck, adjusted her gloves, and set out on her route, her mind still replaying the events of Tommy's birthday party. The laughter, the games, the way the kids had listened so intently to her stories. It all felt like a dream she didn't want to wake up from. For the first time in years, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, as though she wasn't just collecting trash, but contributing something meaningful to the world. As she approached Tommy's street, her thoughts were interrupted by something unusual peeking out of a recycling bin. At first glance, it looked like a crumpled piece of paper, partially hidden beneath an empty soda can. Curious, she pulled it out and smoothed it flat against her knee. What she saw took her breath away. It was one of Tommy's chalk drawings, now preserved on paper. The artwork depicted her driving her garbage truck, surrounded by smiling stick figures holding balloons. In bold letters beneath the image were the words, "Heroes work hard." Her heart swelled as she stared at the picture, tracing the letters with her fingers. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a message, a tribute to everything she did every single day. Mrs. Roos couldn't help but smile as tears welled up in her eyes. She folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into her pocket, vowing to keep it safe. That evening, after finishing her shift, she stopped by a local craft store and bought a simple wooden frame. Back home, she placed the drawing inside, admiring how it looked under the soft glow of her living room lamp. The vibrant colors and heartfelt message brightened the entire room, filling it with warmth and meaning. The next day, Mrs. Roos decided to share the drawing with her coworkers during their lunch break. She brought it to the sanitation department's break room, where everyone gathered around to admire it. "This is incredible," said Carlos, one of her fellow drivers, shaking his head in disbelief. "Who made this?" "It's from a little boy named Tommy," Mrs. Roos explained, her voice filled with pride. He invited me to his birthday party last weekend. This must be his way of saying thank you." Her coworkers exchanged glances, visibly moved by the gesture. Many of them had been doing this job for years, often feeling invisible or unappreciated. But here was proof that someone, especially a child, noticed their efforts and valued them. One by one, they began sharing their own stories of small acts of kindness they'd encountered over the years, moments that reminded them why they kept going despite the challenges. Inspired by Tommy's drawing, the group started brainstorming ways to give back to the community. "What if we visited schools and taught kids about recycling?" suggested Maria, another driver. "We could show them how important it is to take care of the environment." "That's a great idea," Mrs. Ruse agreed. "And maybe we could hand out reusable water bottles or bags as reminders." Over the next few days, the team worked together to plan an outreach program. They'd reached out to local schools, offering to host assemblies and workshops. To their surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Teachers and principals jumped at the opportunity, eager to teach students about sustainability, while honoring the hardworking individuals who kept their neighborhoods clean. When the first school visit finally arrived, Mrs. Ruse stood nervously in front of a packed auditorium, clutching Tommy's framed drawing. As she shared her story with the wide-eyed students, she realized how much had changed since that fateful birthday party. What started as a simple act of kindness from a little boy had grown into something far greater, a movement to recognize and celebrate unsung heroes. By the end of the presentation, the room erupted in applause, and Mrs. Ruse felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She glanced down at the drawing in her hands, silently thanking Tommy for reminding her, and everyone else, that even the smallest gestures can spark big changes. The ripple effect of Tommy's simple invitation continued to spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The sanitation crew's school visits became a regular part of their schedule, and each assembly seemed to inspire more kindness and awareness in the community. But it wasn't just the children who were moved. Adults began taking notice too. Local businesses started stepping up, wanting to show their appreciation for the hardworking individuals who kept the town clean. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Ruse arrived at her usual coffee shop before starting her route. She was surprised when the barista handed her a cup of coffee with a note taped to it. "Thank you for all that you do. Your drink is on us today." Confused but touched, she looked around and saw several other sanitation workers receiving the same treatment. Word had gotten out about their efforts, and the shop owner decided to offer free coffee to every garbage collector who stopped by that day. As weeks went by, similar gestures popped up across the neighborhood. A bakery began donating leftover bread and pastries to the sanitation department every Friday, ensuring the team had snacks during their long shifts. A car wash offered free services to garbage trucks once a month, making them sparkle like new. Even strangers walking down the street would pause to say thank you or give a small wave when they saw the familiar green vehicles rolling by. It was as if the entire town had woken up to the importance of these unsung heroes. Mrs. Ruse's framed drawing of Tommy's artwork remained the centerpiece of the break room, serving as both inspiration and proof of how one act of kindness could spark change. Her coworkers often gathered around it during lunch breaks, sharing stories of how people's attitudes toward them had shifted. "Kids actually run up to our trucks now," Carlos joked one afternoon, grinning ear to ear. "They ask us questions like we're rock stars." Encouraged by the growing support, the sanitation team decided to take things a step further. They organized a community cleanup event, inviting residents to join them in tidying up parks, streets, and empty lots. Flyers were posted around town, and announcements were made at schools and local meetings. To everyone's delight, hundreds of volunteers showed up on the designated Saturday morning, armed with gloves, trash bags, and determination. Tommy, of course, was among the first to arrive, dragging his parents along with him. He proudly wore a bright orange vest borrowed from Mrs. Ruse, declaring himself an honorary member of the sanitation crew. Together, the group tackled littered areas that had been neglected for years. By the end of the day, Piles of trash had been cleared away, revealing hidden beauty beneath, wildflowers blooming in forgotten corners, sparkling streams running through the woods, and open spaces ready for picnics and play. As the sun set over the newly cleaned park, the sanitation team hosted a small celebration to thank the volunteers. There were hot dogs grilled on portable stoves, cold sodas, and plenty of laughter. Mrs. Ruse stood on a makeshift stage, holding a microphone as she addressed the crowd. "None of this would have happened without a little boy who believed in us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tommy taught us that even the smallest acts of kindness can create waves of change. Today, we didn't just clean up our town, we brought it closer together." The audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. Tommy blushed furiously as everyone turned to look at him, cheering and whistling. For a moment, he felt like the most important person in the world, not because he was being praised, but because he realized he helped make others feel valued. That night, as Mrs. Ruse drove home, she thought about how much life had changed since that fateful birthday party. What started as a simple chalk drawing had grown into something extraordinary, a movement that united a town and reminded everyone of the power of gratitude and connection. And though she knew there would still be challenges ahead, she faced them with renewed hope, knowing that she and her team were no longer invisible. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Tommy and Mrs. Ruse grew stronger, becoming a cornerstone of both their lives. Inspired by the impact of his birthday invitation, Tommy began spending more time with Mrs. Ruse, eager to learn about her work and the importance of taking care of the environment. On weekends, he would tag along with her on her route, riding in the passenger seat of the garbage truck, like a proud apprentice. At first, his parents were hesitant. After all, it wasn't every day an 8-year-old joined a sanitation crew. But they soon realized how much this experience meant to him. Tommy quickly proved himself to be a helpful little assistant. He learned how to sort recyclables from regular trash, helped carry lighter bags to the truck, and even reminded Mrs. Ruse to stay hydrated during long shifts. In return, she taught him valuable lessons about responsibility, teamwork, and appreciating the hard work that often goes unnoticed. "You know, Tommy," she told him one morning as they loaded bins into the truck, "every job matters, no matter how big or small. Even picking up trash can make the world a better place." The neighborhood took notice of their partnership. Neighbors who once barely acknowledged Mrs. Ruse now waved enthusiastically when they saw her truck rolling down the street, with Tommy sitting proudly beside her. Some even started leaving handwritten notes of thanks alongside their bins. "Thank you for keeping our streets clean," or "We see you, and we appreciate you." These small gestures meant the world to Mrs. Ruse and her team, reinforcing the idea that their efforts truly made a difference. Word of Tommy's dedication spread beyond the neighborhood, catching the attention of local media. A reporter visited one Saturday to interview Mrs. Ruse and Tommy about their unusual friendship and the positive changes it had sparked in the community. The story aired on the evening news, featuring clips of Tommy helping unload trash and Mrs. Ruse talking passionately about the importance of recognizing unsung heroes. By the end of the segment, viewers across the city were inspired to think differently about the people who kept their communities running smoothly. The attention didn't stop there. Schools in neighboring towns reached out, asking Mrs. Ruse and her team to host similar assemblies and workshops. Before long, the sanitation crew was traveling to different areas, spreading their message of environmental care and gratitude. Each visit left a lasting impression, not only on the students but also on the workers themselves. For the first time in years, they felt celebrated and respected, not just as garbage collectors, but as educators and role models. Back in their own neighborhood, the spirit of kindness continued to flourish. Residents organized monthly gatherings where everyone came together to beautify shared spaces, plant trees, and share meals. Tommy became a beloved figure at these events, always ready with ideas for new projects. Whether it was painting murals on old walls or setting up recycling stations in public parks, He approached everything with boundless energy and enthusiasm. Mrs. Ruiz watched with pride as the boy who had once invited her to his birthday party blossomed into a young advocate for change. She often thought about how far they'd come since that sunny afternoon when Tommy handed her his chalk drawing. That simple gesture had set off a chain reaction, transforming not just their lives but the entire community. Strangers had become friends, and forgotten spaces had been given new life, all because one child chose to see someone else's worth. One evening, as they sat together under the stars after a long day of volunteering, Tommy turned to Mrs. Ruiz and asked, "Do you think other kids will do stuff like this too?" She smiled, ruffling his hair affectionately. "I know they will, champ. You've shown them that even the smallest actions can create big changes. And someday, they'll pass that lesson on to others, just like you did." Tommy grinned, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. He didn't fully understand yet how much his kindness had impacted the world around him, but he didn't need to. All he knew was that he wanted to keep making it a better place, one garbage bag, one smile, and one act of kindness at a time. Years passed, but the legacy of Tommy's simple invitation never faded. What had started as a small act of kindness grew into something that shaped not only his life, but also the lives of countless others in the community and beyond. As Tommy grew older, he carried the lessons he learned from Mrs. Ruiz with him wherever he went. Lessons about gratitude, hard work, and seeing the value in everyone, no matter their role or background. By the time Tommy reached high school, his reputation as a thoughtful and determined young man was well known. He became the driving force behind several initiatives aimed at helping overlooked members of the community. Whether it was organizing food drives for bus drivers who worked long hours without breaks or setting up free car washes for postal workers, Tommy made it his mission to ensure that no one felt invisible. His classmates often joked that he had a superpower for spotting people who needed recognition and lifting them up in meaningful ways. Mrs. Ruiz, now nearing retirement, watched proudly as Tommy continued to inspire those around him. She often joined him at events, sharing stories of how it all began with a birthday party and a chalk drawing. Together, they spoke at schools, community centers, and even conferences, spreading their message of appreciation and connection. Their partnership became legendary in the town, symbolizing what could happen when kindness met action. One day, during Tommy's senior year, the city council announced plans to build a new park in honor of individuals who contributed to making the community stronger. To everyone's delight, the park was named after both Tommy and Mrs. Ruiz, a testament to the impact they'd made together. The centerpiece of the park was a mural painted by local artists, depicting scenes from their journey. Mrs. Ruiz driving her garbage truck, Tommy handing her the chalk drawing, and the two of them standing side by side surrounded by smiling faces. Beneath the mural were the words, "Heroes work hard," etched permanently into stone. On the day of the park's grand opening, the entire town turned out to celebrate. Families brought picnic blankets, children played on newly installed swings, and speeches were given under a bright blue sky. When it was Tommy's turn to speak, he looked out at the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't know it back then," he began, "but inviting Mrs. Ruiz to my birthday party changed everything. For me, for her, and for this whole community. It taught me that we're all connected, and that recognizing someone's worth can start a chain reaction of kindness. None of us are invisible if we take the time to see each other." The audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. Mrs. Ruiz stood beside him, her arm wrapped around his shoulders, beaming with pride. For a moment, she reflected on how far they'd come since that sunny afternoon years ago. She thought about the framed drawing still hanging in the sanitation department's break room, the friendships formed, and the countless lives touched along the way. As the celebration wound down, Tommy wandered over to the mural, running his fingers lightly over the painted image of himself as a child. Mrs. Ruiz joined him, standing quietly for a moment before speaking. "You've grown into such an amazing young man, Tommy," she said softly. I hope you know how much you've inspired me, and so many others." Tommy smiled, turning to look at her. "And I hope you know how much you've inspired me. You showed me that being kind isn't just about saying thank you. It's about seeing people for who they really are." Years later, as Tommy pursued a career advocating for underserved communities, he often returned to the park named after him and Mrs. Ruiz. Each visit reminded him of the power of a single act of kindness and how it could ripple outward, touching hearts and changing lives. And though Mrs. Ruiz eventually retired, her legacy lived on, not just in the park, but in every person who had been inspired to pay attention, lend a hand, and recognize the heroes among them. In the end, what Tommy and Mrs. Ruiz created wasn't just a story. It was a movement, a reminder that even the smallest gestures can leave the biggest marks. And as long as there were people willing to see and appreciate one another, their story would continue to unfold, inspiring generations to come. A few weeks after the school visits began, the sanitation crew's efforts started gaining attention far beyond what anyone had expected. Word of their presentation spread quickly through the community, thanks to excited children who couldn't stop talking about the garbage heroes who had visited their classrooms. Parents, teachers, and even local news outlets took notice, eager to learn more about the people behind the trucks that rumbled through the streets every morning. One sunny Friday afternoon, Tommy's school hosted its own special assembly featuring Mrs. Ruiz and her team. The gymnasium buzzed with anticipation as students filed in, their chatter filling the air. Posters about recycling and environmental care lined the walls, created by the kids themselves after hearing about the upcoming event. When Mrs. Ruiz walked in, wearing her uniform and carrying Tommy's framed drawing, the room erupted into applause. She smiled shyly, waving to the crowd as she made her way to the stage. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm Elena Ruiz, and I've been a garbage collector for over 10 years. Some of you might know me. I drive one of the big green trucks you see on your street." A few kids waved enthusiastically, shouting, "We know you," or "You picked up my trash last week." Mrs. Ruiz laughed warmly before continuing. "Today, I'm here to talk about something really important. How we can all work together to keep our planet clean and healthy. But first, I want to share a story about a very special boy named Tommy." She held up the framed drawing, turning it so the audience could see. "This is Tommy's artwork. He gave it to me after inviting me to his birthday party, a party where no one had ever thought to invite someone like me before. This picture reminds me that what we do matters, even if it doesn't always seem glamorous. Every time we pick up your trash, sort recyclables, or teach others how to take care of the earth, we're making a difference." The students listened intently, their eyes glued to the colorful drawing and Mrs. Ruiz's kind face. She went on to explain the importance of reducing waste, reusing items whenever possible, and properly sorting recyclables. Her coworkers joined in, sharing funny stories about finding misplaced treasures in bins, like wedding rings, antique clocks, and even a live turtle once. The kids roared with laughter, hanging onto every word. To make the lesson stick, the team handed out reusable water bottles to each student, along with a small note attached to each one. The notes read, "Thank you for helping us protect the planet. Together, we can make a big difference." The children clutched their gifts tightly, beaming with pride at being called environmental superheroes. After the assembly, the impact was immediate. Students began bringing their new water bottles to school instead of disposable ones, and classrooms started competitions to see who could recycle the most. Parents noticed changes too. Kids were reminding them to separate plastics from paper and asking questions about composting. Even local businesses got involved, offering discounts to sanitation workers as a token of gratitude. For Mrs. Ruiz and her team, the transformation was overwhelming but deeply rewarding. They'd spent years feeling invisible, yet now they were celebrated as role models. Letters poured in from families thanking them for their dedication, and handmade thank you cards decorated the walls of the sanitation department's break room. One card, written in shaky crayon letters, simply said, "You're my hero because you help the earth stay happy." But perhaps the most touching moment came when Tommy's principal announced a new tradition, an annual Community Heroes Day, dedicated to recognizing not only sanitation workers, but also other overlooked contributors like mail carriers, crossing guards, and librarians. The idea was met with cheers from both students and staff, cementing the belief that everyone plays a vital role in keeping the community strong. As Mrs. Ruse drove home that evening, she reflected on how much had changed since Tommy's birthday party. What began as a single act of kindness had blossomed into a movement that united an entire town. And while she knew there would still be tough days ahead, early mornings, long hours, and messy bins, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Thanks to Tommy and his big heart, she and her colleagues had been given something priceless: visibility, respect, and hope for a brighter future.